Sir, is that this is not about drugs. This is about regime change. And we also have the White House Chief of Staff on record saying that this is about regime change. It has nothing to do with drugs. I rise today in strong support of this resolution. I am proud to co-lead Ranking Member Meeks' effort and urge all of my colleagues to join us today in reasserting this body's constitutional authority on matters of war and peace. Because let's be perfectly clear, only Congress has the power to declare war. The Trump administration's military escalation in the Caribbean is not only reckless, it is blatantly illegal. We cannot allow this kind of dangerous overreach to go unchecked. Trump, a president who touts himself as a global peacemaker, has appointed himself as judge, jury, and executioner in the Western Hemisphere.
What you just witnessed in Representative Ilhan Omar's absolutely searing indictment of Trump's Caribbean military escalation is nothing less than a constitutional reckoning colliding headlong with the ravenous machinery of American imperialism reborn, and this moment is your signal that democracy itself stands at the precipice, because when Omar declares that only Congress holds the sacred power to declare war, she is not engaging in procedural pedantry, but rather wielding the fundamental architecture of checks and balances against an executive branch that has appointed itself judge, jury, and executioner across the Western Hemisphere. And you need to understand that what's happening right now off the coast of Venezuela, with at least 95 people killed and 25 known strikes on vessels, represents an inflection point where the bloody sinews of empire become visible in ways that should shake every single person who claims to care about human rights, international law, or basic democratic accountability, because this is not just about one authoritarian president overreaching. This is about the entire diseased logic of American exceptionalism metastasizing into something even more monstrous and immediate. When Omar stands on that House floor and calls out the White House Chief of Staff for saying on record that this military campaign has nothing to do with drugs, but everything to do with regime change, she is ripping away the gauzy propaganda veil that the national security apparatus drapes over its imperial adventures, and what you discover underneath is breathtaking in its cynical brutality, because the claim that the objective is fighting drugs is not credible, given the magnitude of the U.S. military buildup and show of force. And let's be absolutely clear about what this means in practice, because the U.S. military has amassed more than a dozen warships and 15,000 troops into the region as part of what the Pentagon branded Operation Southern Spear. And when you deploy the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is billed by the U.S. Navy as the most capable, adaptable, and lethal combat platform in the world, you are not interdicting fishing boats, you are preparing for war. And the fact that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and top military brass have briefed Trump on options for military operations inside Venezuela, as he weighs the risks and benefits of launching a scaled-up campaign to potentially oust President Nicolás Maduro, tells you everything about the true objective here, which has precisely nothing to do with fentanyl or cocaine, and everything to do with reasserting American dominance over a hemisphere that Washington has long considered its exclusive imperial playground. But here's where it gets even more explosive, and why Omar's intervention is so absolutely vital in this moment. Because the Trump administration's legal justification for these strikes is not just flimsy, it's essentially non-existent. Administration officials told lawmakers that the U.S. didn't have a legal justification that would support attacks against any land targets, which means that what we're witnessing is extrajudicial killing on a massive scale, dressed up in the language of counter-narcotics, when in reality, about 90% of U.S.-bound cocaine transits the Eastern Pacific and Western Caribbean, not near Venezuela's coast, and furthermore, Venezuela is not a major supplier of narcotics to the United States, as the 2024 Drug Enforcement Agency National Drug Threat Assessment does not mention Venezuela at all, so the entire drug trafficking rationale collapses under the slightest scrutiny, revealing what progressive analysts and Venezuelan opposition figures have been saying all along. U.S. objectives have shifted toward regime change, with Trump acknowledging the possibility of strikes within Venezuelan territory, and this is where the historical echoes become deafening, because what we're watching is the Monroe Doctrine reanimated for the 21st century. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth declaring, "The Western Hemisphere is America's neighborhood, and we will protect it," which is the exact ideological framework that justified decades of coups, death squads, and military interventions from Guatemala to Chile to Nicaragua. And you need to sit with the sheer audacity of what Trump is doing here, because the symbolic weight of the massive U.S. naval force off the country, which includes the most advanced U.S. aircraft carrier, means any resolution to the crisis that does not lead to Maduro's ouster would be a rebuke to U.S. power and Trump's prestige. So Trump has backed himself into a corner where either he launches an illegal war of aggression against a sovereign nation, or he suffers a humiliating geopolitical defeat. And this is how imperial logic works. It creates its own momentum, its own inexorable drive toward violence, because the maintenance of hegemonic credibility becomes more important than human life, international law, or democratic process. And when Maduro's government responds by saying, "It has always been about our natural wealth, our oil, our energy, the resources that belong exclusively to the Venezuelan people," they are articulating what should be blindingly obvious to anyone paying attention, which is that this is a resource grab, a naked imperial project, to reassert control over Venezuela, which has the world's largest proven oil reserves, and a long coastline on the Caribbean Sea, which is a vital sea lane for U.S. goods traveling through the Panama Canal, and the fact that under sanctions Venezuela signed several energy and mining deals with China, in addition to Iran and Russia, makes clear why Washington suddenly discovered this urgent security threat, because what the national security establishment cannot tolerate is not drug trafficking or migration, but rather independent powers in the hemisphere that refuse to subordinate their development to American corporate interests. Now let's talk about what Omar's War Powers Resolution actually does, and why it matters so profoundly, because Omar introduced a War Powers Resolution to terminate unauthorized UN military hostilities against Venezuela and transnational criminal organizations that the Trump administration has unilaterally designated as foreign terrorist organizations, and this is constitutionally crucial because the resolution reasserts Article 1 authority, making clear that neither the 2001 nor the 2002 authorizations for use of military force provide legal cover for new conflicts in Latin America, and furthermore, it underscores that a foreign terrorist organization designation, as defined by U.S. law, does not authorize the use of military force, contrary to recent claims from the Trump administration. And what this means is that Omar and her progressive colleagues are forcing every single member of Congress to go on record about whether they believe in the constitutional separation of powers, or whether they're willing to rubber stamp an executive branch that operates with complete impunity, launching strikes that kill dozens of people without any congressional debate, authorization, or oversight whatsoever, because these are illegal hostilities that could destabilize the entire region and fuel mass migration, and Congress must stop this unconstitutional military campaign by passing these war powers resolutions. The human cost of this imperial adventure is already catastrophic and growing by the day, because Trump's so-called counter-narcotics campaign has involved 20 strikes in the Caribbean Sea and Eastern Pacific Ocean that have killed 80 people, with reports indicating that Hegseth gave a verbal order to SEAL Team 6 to leave no survivors, with 2 men who survived the initial strike being killed in a subsequent double-tap strike, which if true represents war crimes, plain and simple, the deliberate targeting of survivors which violates every norm of international humanitarian law. Legal analysts have said that the strikes almost certainly constitute a violation of U.S. and international law, since drug traffickers are not considered combatants in a military conflict. So what we have here is not law enforcement, it's not even conventional warfare, it's state-sanctioned murder, carried out in international waters, against people who have not been charged, convicted, or given any semblance of due process. And when Venezuelan sources and Colombian President Gustavo Petro say that civilians and their own citizens may be among the dead, this becomes an international crisis that implicates not just Trump, but everyone in Congress who fails to exercise their constitutional duty to check this runaway executive power. But the really chilling dimension that progressives need to understand is how this Venezuela escalation fits into Trump's broader authoritarian project beneficently, because Trump has claimed that the U.S. faces an invasion of violent migrants, drug traffickers, and criminal groups in order to make sweeping emergency declarations and use wartime powers like those imbued in the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, by saying an invasion by the gang Tren de Aragua was masterminded by Maduro himself, even though a report from the National Intelligence Council in April appeared to contradict his claims, finding no evidence of coordination between the Tren de Aragua gang and the Maduro administration. So Trump is fabricating a national security threat to justify both external military aggression and internal authoritarian measures, and this is the classic fascist playbook, manufacturing foreign enemies to consolidate domestic power, to crack down on migrants, to militarize society, and to dissolve the constitutional constraints that prevent a president from ruling by decree. And the fact that Defense Department contracting documents show the Trump administration plans to maintain a significantly increased military presence in the Caribbean through the remainder of President Trump's term in office, with the potential for escalation between the U.S. and Venezuela, particularly high, means this is not a temporary crisis but rather a sustained military posture that could explode into full-scale war at any moment. The historical parallels here are not subtle. They are screaming at us from every corner of Latin American history because what Trump is attempting follows the exact playbook that Washington has deployed again and again across the 20th century, and to fully understand Washington's current war path, it's necessary to revisit earlier episodes in which the U.S. intervened violently and anti-democratically to shape the political destinies of countries in the hemisphere, with Cuba, Guatemala, and Chile being especially instructive as they illuminate the long arc of U.S. imperialism in Latin America and clarify the dangers of the present confrontation. And when you look at what happened in Guatemala in 1954, where the CIA orchestrated a coup against the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz because he dared to implement land reform that threatened United Fruit Company's profits, or when you examine Chile in 1973, where the U.S. backed Pinochet's bloody overthrow of Salvador Allende, leading to decades of dictatorship, torture, and disappearances, you see the same pattern of American power crushing any government that attempts to use its natural resources for the benefit of its own people, rather than for the enrichment of foreign capital. And when Hugo Chavez became president in 1998 and pursued policies of popular sovereignty and resource nationalism aimed at ensuring Venezuela's vast oil reserves served Venezuelans rather than being siphoned off to enrich foreign corporations, Venezuela became the latest target of Washington's efforts to undermine discipline and ultimately neutralize troublesome progressive governments across Latin America. And this is why Omar's framing is so intellectually and morally powerful, because she's not just talking about constitutional procedure, she's connecting this military escalation to the entire rotten edifice of American imperialism. And when she says Trump has appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner, she is naming the authoritarian logic that pervades not just this administration, but the bipartisan consensus around American military dominance that has persisted through Democratic and Republican presidencies alike, because while Trump's methods may be more brazen and unilateral, the underlying assumption that the United States has the right to determine which governments in Latin America are legitimate and which must be overthrown has been Washington's operating principle since the Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed in 1823, and that formal project dates back to when the U.S. unilaterally claimed Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence, and its revival today is unmistakable and distinctly dangerous, with the results of that doctrine having long been clear, including immense profits for the few, and violence, political upheaval, social dislocation, and economic devastation for the many. Now here's where the analysis has to sharpen even further, because some will argue that Maduro is authoritarian, that he stole the 2024 election, that he's repressive, and all of those critiques have varying degrees of validity, but that is entirely beside the point when it comes to whether the United States has the legal, moral, or practical right to launch a military campaign to overthrow him, because if past his prologue, a U.S. attempt to overthrow Maduro would not end well, as leaders brought to power by outside actors are more likely than other leaders to be ousted violently, with nearly half of externally imposed leaders later removed by force, often because they are viewed as weak or illegitimate, either because they lack broad domestic support or are seen as puppets of a foreign government. And every single expert on Latin America, who isn't on the payroll of the defense industry or a right-wing think tank, has been sounding the alarm that Trump's threats to topple Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro prove the U.S. has learned nothing from nearly 25 years of misadventures in the Middle East, where the win-loss record makes it painfully clear that regime change unleashes more problems than it solves, and forcefully breaking the Maduro regime could break Venezuela itself and spur chaos in the hemisphere. Because when you destabilize a country of 28 million people that's already experiencing the largest displacement crisis in Latin American history, you don't get democracy and stability. You get Libya, you get Iraq, you get Afghanistan, you get years or decades of civil conflict, warlordism, humanitarian catastrophe, and the very migration crisis that Trump claims to be preventing. And let's address the elephant in the room, which is that Trump's obsession with Venezuela is intimately connected to his broader geopolitical vision of reasserting American dominance against China, because for Beijing, Venezuela is both an energy source and a foothold in the hemisphere, and the Trump administration's national security strategy makes clear this is unacceptable to the United States. So what we're really witnessing is the United States attempting to roll back Chinese influence in Latin America through military force and the threat of regime change, which means this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about establishing a precedent that any Latin American government that seeks economic partnerships with China or pursues independent development strategies will face American military intervention, and Trump views Latin America as America's backyard, where a military buildup is also a show of strength against China, which has become the region's biggest economic partner in recent years, and this should terrify anyone who understands that great power competition historically leads to proxy wars, interventions, and immense human suffering for the people caught in the crossfire. The coalition that Omar has assembled around this war powers resolution is significant because representatives including Ranking Member Meeks of Foreign Affairs, Ranking Member Smith of Armed Services, Ranking Member Himes of Intelligence, Ranking Member Thompson of Homeland Security, and Ranking Member Crow of Armed Services Subcommittee on Intelligence and Special Operations introduced the resolution to block Trump from continuing to use U.S. armed forces to conduct strikes in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific operations carried out for more than 60 days without congressional authorization, and the fact that these are not just progressive firebrands but ranking members of the most powerful national security committees in Congress signals that Trump's overreach has become so egregious that even establishment Democrats who typically defer to executive prerogatives on military matters are saying enough is enough, and the Constitution grants Congress, not the President, the power to declare war, and without congressional approval, the President is not only circumventing the legislative branch, but grossly expanding his power to act as judge, jury, and executioner, which is language that echoes Omar's floor speech and indicates a growing recognition that what's at stake here transcends partisan politics and goes to the very heart of whether America functions as a constitutional democracy or as an imperial autocracy. But we also have to be realistic about the political terrain, because as of November, the U.S. Senate has twice rejected resolutions that would limit Trump's authority to continue military action against Venezuela or airstrikes against alleged drug vessels, and polling shows that Trump retains widespread backing among his base for a series of attacks that killed more than 90 people, which reveals the disturbing degree to which American political culture has been militarized and how much of the public accepts extrajudicial killing as legitimate policy when it's framed through the war on drugs or the threat of migration, and this is precisely why progressive movements need to be making the moral case against imperialism loudly and repeatedly, not just the constitutional or pragmatic case, but the fundamental ethical argument that other people's lives matter, that Venezuelans, Colombians, and everyone else in Latin America have the right to self-determination, and that American bombs and bullets are not instruments of liberation, but of domination and death. The immediate stakes could not be higher, because Trump is ordering a blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers into Venezuela, ramping up pressure on Maduro, in a move designed to put a tighter chokehold on the South American country's economy, after U.S. forces seized an oil tanker off Venezuela's coast following a buildup of military forces in the region. And a naval blockade is historically considered an act of war, which means we are already in a state of undeclared hostilities that could explode into full-scale armed conflict with minimal warning. The campaign has killed at least 95 people in 25 known strikes on vessels, with Trump saying for weeks that the U.S. will move its campaign beyond the water and start strikes on land. So this is not theoretical, this is not hypothetical. American military forces are poised to launch strikes inside Venezuelan territory, which would constitute an invasion and would almost certainly trigger a broader regional war with catastrophic consequences for millions of people. What progressives must understand is that this Venezuela crisis is a test case for whether the American left can mount effective opposition to imperial war-making in real time, rather than years after the fact when the damage has already been done and the body count has already mounted, and with floor votes expected in the House. Progressives are urging lawmakers to back resolutions aimed at preventing Trump from launching an unauthorized war, asking, will you stand up for the Constitution and vote to stop Trump's illegal war-making or not? And this is the kind of clear moral and political line that needs to be drawn, because there is no middle ground here either. You support congressional authority over war powers and oppose illegal military aggression, or you enable an autocratic president to launch wars of choice against countries that pose no threat to American security. And Omar and Garcia warned that Trump's recent actions and rhetoric are driving us toward a catastrophic forever war in Venezuela, and they're absolutely correct, because once American troops are committed, once casualties start mounting, once national prestige becomes invested in the outcome, it becomes exponentially harder to extract ourselves, and we end up with another multi-year or multi-decade quagmire, draining resources, destroying lives, and accomplishing nothing except the enrichment of defense contractors and the expansion of the national security state. The Venezuela situation also exposes the bankruptcy of mainstream liberal foreign policy, because where has the robust opposition been from Democratic leadership? Where are the primetime speeches from Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries demanding that Trump cease this illegal military campaign? Where are the wall-to-wall cable news coverage holding the administration accountable for extrajudicial killings in international waters? And the answer is that institutional Democrats have been largely silent or equivocal, because the bipartisan consensus around American military primacy runs deep into. For many Democratic politicians are terrified of being labeled weak on national security, or soft on drugs, or sympathetic to authoritarian regimes, so they abdicate their constitutional responsibilities and allow the imperial war machine to roll forward, and this is why figures like Ilhan Omar and the Congressional Progressive Caucus are so absolutely essential, because they are willing to take principled stands that are unpopular with the foreign policy establishment but are morally necessary and constitutionally correct. And we need to connect this to the longer historical arc of U.S.-Latin America relations, because by the mid-1970s, Latin America had been transformed into a hemisphere dominated by U.S.-backed, right-wing authoritarian regimes, and independent powers in this hemisphere, going their own way, were the threat that Washington and Wall Street could never tolerate, which is the same reason the United States is once again maneuvering toward open conflict in Venezuela, and the lesson of such imperial adventurism in Latin America is unmistakable, as when Washington interferes in other nations, the outcome is never stability or democracy, but their absolute negation. So every single intervention, from the overthrow of Arbenz to the Bay of Pigs, to the Contra War and Fertain Pulipenteps against Chavez, has resulted in more violence, more instability, more human suffering, not less, and yet the American foreign policy establishment learns nothing, retains no institutional memory, and continues to believe that this time will be different, that this intervention will succeed where all the others failed, and the results are always the same: death, destruction, and the strengthening of the very forces that American intervention claims to combat. What Omar is doing by introducing this war powers resolution, and by making this floor speech, is she's performing the essential democratic function of naming what is happening, of refusing to allow euphemism and propaganda to obscure the brutal reality that American military forces are killing people in international waters without legal authorization in pursuit of a regime change agenda that has nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with maintaining imperial control over Latin America's natural resources and political trajectories. And when she invokes Congress's constitutional war powers, she's not being a procedural stickler, she's defending the most basic principle of Republican government, which is that wars cannot be waged by executive fiat, but require the deliberation and authorization of the people's representatives, and the fact that Trump and his administration, completely dispensed with even the pretense of seeking congressional approval, reveals their contempt for democratic norms and their embrace of authoritarian governance, where the president's will is law, and military force is deployed at his personal discretion, without accountability or constraint. The global implications here extend far beyond Venezuela, because if the United States can unilaterally bomb vessels in international waters, kill nearly 100 people, deploy massive naval forces and threaten regime change against a sovereign nation without UN Security Council authorization, without congressional approval, without any meaningful legal justification, then international law means nothing. The UN Charter means nothing. The entire post-World War II architecture designed to prevent aggressive war and protect national sovereignty collapses into irrelevance, and we return to a world where might makes right, where powerful nations do whatever they want to, weaker nations, and where there is no recourse, no accountability, no justice, only the raw exercise of imperial power, and this should concern everyone, regardless of what they think about Maduro or Venezuelan politics, because a world without legal constraints on the use of military force is a world perpetually on the brink of catastrophic war. And let's be very clear about what regime change would actually look like in practice, because we're not talking about surgical strikes or clean transitions. We're talking about bombing campaigns that destroy infrastructure, kill civilians, and create humanitarian emergencies. We're talking about possible ground invasions, urban warfare, and all the chaos that accompanies the collapse of state authority. We're talking about a country that already has millions of displaced people experiencing even greater refugee flows that would destabilize neighboring countries and potentially reach the U.S. border, creating the exact migration crisis that Trump claims to be preventing. And removing Maduro might be militarily feasible, but stabilizing Venezuela afterward could be far harder, as any intervention risks humanitarian disaster, regional backlash, and entanglement with other major powers, with the likely outcome being high costs for the U.S. with limited strategic benefit. This is not speculation. This is the pattern from every regime change operation the United States has conducted in the 21st century, where the initial military phase goes relatively smoothly, but the aftermath devolves into years of sectarian violence, failed state dynamics, and regional spillover. What Omar and her colleagues are demanding is that Congress fulfill its constitutional obligation, and that the American people wake up to what is being done in their name, because Trump's illegal extrajudicial killings off the coast of Venezuela are an unauthorized and unconstitutional use of military force that put service members at risk, and lawmakers have a duty to stand up for their voters and their prerogatives to prevent another unnecessary and costly war of choice, and this is the language of accountability, the insistence that elected representatives have responsibilities that they cannot simply outsource to an executive branch that operates in secrecy and claims unlimited authority over matters of war and peace, and the coalition supporting this resolution includes human rights organizations, faith groups, policy experts, and civil society organizations who understand that what's happening in the Caribbean right now is not just a foreign policy matter, it's a moral crisis that demands urgent action and popular mobilization. The cynicism of Trump's drug war rhetoric is particularly galling because, as multiple experts have pointed out, stopping drug trafficking is exceptionally hard to achieve with targeted strikes, and Venezuela is not the hub of narco-trafficking, as that route begins in neighboring Colombia and ends on the U.S. border in Mexico, with Venezuela being a facilitator, perhaps a tenth of the problem at worst, and the drug trade being so unspeakably profitable that no kinetic activity can really stop it, as the incentives are simply too great. So the entire premise that military strikes against boats or even targets inside Venezuela will meaningfully reduce drug flows to the United States is laughable on its face, and yet this is the justification being offered for actions that have already killed nearly 100 people and could trigger a regional war, and this reveals that the drug war has always been a pretext for militarization, for social control, for imperial intervention, never a genuine public health strategy, because if you actually wanted to reduce drug deaths in America, you would invest in treatment harm reduction and addressing the despair and economic devastation that drives addiction, not in bombing fishing boats in the Caribbean. The nakedness of the resource grab is also becoming impossible to ignore, because Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who won the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize, is pitching a post-Maduro future to U.S. investors, describing a U.S. $1.7 trillion opportunity to privatize Venezuela's oil, gas, and infrastructure, with the message being clear that regime change could unlock vast wealth. So what we have here is a coordination between the Trump administration, the Venezuelan right-wing opposition, and American corporate interests to overthrow a government not because it's authoritarian. There are plenty of authoritarian U.S. allies who face no pressure whatsoever, but because it refuses to allow foreign corporations unfettered access to its resources. And this is imperialism in its most classical form, the use of military force to open markets and secure access to raw materials for the benefit of capital, and the fact that this is happening so brazenly with opposition figures, literally advertising investment opportunities contingent on regime change, should make the imperial logic transparent to anyone paying attention. Now, as this commentary draws toward its conclusion, understand that what Ilhan Omar has done in that floor speech, and with this War Powers resolution, is provide a rallying point for everyone who believes that American foreign policy must be grounded in law, democracy, and human rights rather than in imperial domination and extrajudicial violence, and the question for every person who considers themselves progressive or liberal or simply committed to constitutional government is: will you support this resolution? Will you call your representatives? Will you organize? Will you protest? Will you make it politically untenable for Congress to rubber stamp another illegal war? Or will you let this moment pass? Will you stay silent while Trump launches strikes inside Venezuela, while more people die, while the region slides toward catastrophe, and then express regret years later when the consequences become undeniable, because that pattern of acquiescence and belated regret is how we got Iraq, is how we got Libya, is how we got decades of failed interventions, and it cannot be allowed to happen again with Venezuela. The path forward requires building a mass anti-war movement that can exert real political pressure, because both Democrats and Republicans must send a strong message to the Trump administration that only Congress can authorize offensive military force, not the president, with the constitutional stakes extending beyond Venezuela. And this means street protests. This means phone banking. This means primary challenges against Democrats who vote to enable Trump's war powers. This means international solidarity with Latin American movements opposing U.S. intervention. This means teach-ins and direct actions, and every form of political mobilization that can shift the political calculus and make clear that the American people will not tolerate another war of aggression launched on false pretenses. And when you hear Trump administration officials or congressional war hawks trying to manufacture consent for this intervention by invoking drugs or terrorism or threats to national security, you need to recognize those claims for what they are, which is propaganda designed to legitimize imperial violence. and you need to reject them categorically and publicly, because silence is complicity and neutrality in this context is impossible. You either oppose this illegal military campaign, or you enable it. There is no middle ground. What Representative Omar has articulated with moral clarity and constitutional precision is that Trump's Venezuela policy is not aberrational. It is the logical extension of American imperial logic that has governed hemispheric relations for 2 centuries, and the only way to break this cycle is for Congress to reassert its war powers, for the American people to demand accountability, and for progressive movements to build the kind of sustained international solidarity that can constrain empire and support self-determination. And the clock is ticking, because strikes on Venezuelan territory could begin at any moment, and once that threshold is crossed, once American and Venezuelan blood is spilled on a larger scale, the political dynamics will shift in ways that make de-escalation exponentially more difficult. So this is the moment to act. This is the moment to call your representatives to join protests to amplify Omar's message, and to make absolutely clear that illegal wars launched by authoritarian presidents will face fierce and unrelenting opposition, because if we fail to stop this, if Venezuela becomes another imperial catastrophe, then the lesson learned by this and future administrations will be that there are no constraints, no accountability, no political costs for illegal military aggression, and the already fragile architecture of international law and democratic governance will suffer damage from which it may never recover. So the stakes could not be higher, and the imperative to act could not be more urgent, and Ilhan Omar has thrown down the gauntlet. Now the question is whether the rest of us will pick it up.